Friday, the International Court of Justice at The Hague issued an interim order where they said that on the face of things, it's possible that Israel may be committing genocide. This is a big thing. There are legal aspects to it, and there are cultural aspects to it. We're really at a hinge historical moment in both arenas. I'll have all the details coming up on In Focus. So on Friday, as expected, the International Court of Justice, which is a political body that's appointed by the General Assembly and the Security Council of the United Nations and reflects the gestalt, which is inherently and institutionally anti-Semitic of both organizations, of both bodies, came out with an interim order on South Africa's charge that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza in its war to protect its national survival after Hamas carried out a one-day genocide against Israel on October 7th. So again, not surprisingly, they came out with this interim order. Now, before we even look at what the order said, I just want to go for a second to what it is that South Africa/Hamas did. What they did was they used this quasi-legal, effectively political instrument called the International Court of Justice at The Hague to promote anti-Semitic propaganda. Was to create this, quote, human rights narrative that justifies anti-Semitic diplomatic action. So you want to commit effective staticide internationally by claiming that Israel is inherently genocidal, it's a Nazi state, it's an apartheid state. So what you do is you engage in political theater in places like the International Court of Justice to buck up your anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that there's something inherently evil about Jewish statehood, about the Jews, about the Jewish state. And they chose this arena, the International Court of Justice, to advance this case, which is the nullification of Israel's right to exist, the nullification of the Jews' right to national self-determination on the international scale in the name of human rights, because Jews are evil and our existence as a nation state inherently impedes the cause of, quote, human rights. And the opinion that the International Court of Justice gave Hamas and South Africa all of the things they sought. It's true, they didn't order Israel to cease its military operations in Gaza, but simply by claiming that there is an on the face of things claim that might be legitimate that Israel is carrying out genocide, they were able to issue two other orders, which were very appalling in nature and also geared towards this idea of criminalizing the very existence of the Jewish state. So the first order that they put out was an order that Israel provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. And, well, it's true that Israel is already providing humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. So therefore, on the face of it, this is egregious because why are you ordering Israel to do what it already is doing? But it's also it assumes that the people of Gaza should be cared for by Israel, that Israel's job as the violated party, as the party that was invaded, is now to protect the people who invaded it. So the humanitarian assistance clause essentially turns morality on its head, and it says that Israel is responsible for the well-being of the people who seek its physical annihilation. And we've talked a lot about the fact that the humanitarian assistance, so-called, is not humanitarian assistance at all. What it is resupply to Hamas. And that's why it's extremely controversial among Israelis, because Israeli civilians, the vast majority of Israelis, recognize what this is. So by saying that we have to deliver this supposed humanitarian assistance, which is resupply to Hamas, what the International Court of Justice is doing is saying that Israel is responsible for the welfare of people who want to annihilate it, which, again, is itself an immoral claim. And then you get to the second order. The second order is that Israel has to prosecute incitement of genocide. So South Africa's claim that Israel is committing genocide was based on, it was a compilation of statements by Israeli leaders comparing the people of Gaza to Amalek, the biblical enemy of Israel that attacked Israel when it was coming out of Egypt and at other times during the biblical narrative. And God ordered Moses and subsequent generations of Jews, like King Saul, to blot out Amalek, to kill them, to leave no memory of Amalek on the face of the earth. And so many Israeli public officials compared the people of Gaza who invaded Israel and carried out sadistic atrocities, the likes of which we hadn't even seen in the Holocaust on October 7th, compared them to Amalek and said that we will annihilate them. And so that was the basis, that biblical quotations made by people across the political spectrum in Israel, across the cultural spectrum in Israel, were largely the basis of South Africa's case, and what the court decided was that, yes, indeed, comparisons to Amalek were calls for genocide. It doesn't matter, obviously, that everybody from Obama to Winston Churchill to whomever, every Tom, Dick, and Jerry who's ever spoken into a microphone over the past 1,000 years has called for the annihilation of an enemy, fits the same distinction, which means that every world leader at all times across history is equally guilty of inciting genocide, but only Israel, of course, is singled out because that's the purpose of this political theater. But then, having singled Israel out, they say that the statements by Israeli public officials, from the president of the University of Tel Aviv to Prime Minister Netanyahu and on, that this requires the Israeli legal system to begin to prosecute incitement to genocide by Israelis. So Israelis are guilty of inciting genocide by saying that we have to eradicate our enemy who seeks the eradication of Israel. So that's the second order. And then Israel was also ordered to report to the World Court within 30 days how it was that we were instituting these two orders that they put out. So people are looking at this and saying, well, it's a win because they didn't call for us to end the war, and therefore this was a great thing that we went there and we were able to mitigate the danger. But it's not true. That's like saying, well, the mugger only beat me up and stole my wallet, and he didn't rape me, and therefore, all in all, it was a successful day. A lot to be thankful for, and this is absurd. But that comes to another aspect of it. Who is making these claims? The people in Israel who are making these claims are people largely on the left. I heard one of the sort of establishment, very far-leaning media organs in Israel giving instant commentary about it on Army radio, actually, last night. And they were saying, yes, this is great. This was a real win. Because, look, they didn't call for us to end the war. And anyway, we're giving humanitarian aid, and this reporting thing, I don't know if we'll do it, but it's not a big deal because we're doing it anyway. We have nothing to worry about. So this is just a concept that's sort of put forward by Israel's legal fraternity that was represented by former president of the Israeli Supreme Court and the author of the concept and the revolution of the judiciary in Israel beginning in the 1990s, former Supreme Court President Aaron Barak, who Israel foolishly appointed to be its ad hoc judge. As the accused, we were allowed to put on an extra judge on the panel at the ICJ to adjudicate the order. And of all the jurists in Israel, we chose the one jurist who, above all, kind of represents the milieu in Israel that accepts the legitimacy of the international rape gang that is used against Israel regularly, routinely at the United Nations and its affiliated organizations and the International Human Rights Committee, Aaron Barak. So Aaron Barak comes in there, and he's supposed to protect us because he's sort of their representative to the Israeli people, the international community, the international human rights community, to the riffraff in Israel. And that's how he's always seen himself, as the leader of the enlightened community in Israel that's going to show us the way to be good people through his judicial diktats that he is going to then convince these otherwise good people that are just deluded or whatever by propaganda at the Hague that Israel isn't committing genocide. But rather than do that, Aaron Barak did two things. First of all, he betrayed Israel because he signed on to these two orders, even though he disagreed that there was a prima facie case for genocide. He said, but still, it's important as a show of goodwill for me to, sign on to these two judgments and trust the legal fraternity in Israel to ensure that nobody's inciting genocide because it's bad. And like the first 2/3, I think, of his judgment that he put out, it was all just self glorifying, where he talked about the fact that he was a Holocaust survivor and he's uniquely capable of understanding the suffering of all involved. He's the person who's on Mount Olympus, and he's looking down at all of us, all of these mere mortals. He's the judicial God, and he's here to save us from ourselves. And then he says that, he's going to sign on as a Holocaust survivor, to this absurd legal insanity that says that there's a prima facie case that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and requiring Israel to give an accounting to this kangaroo court for our operations within Gaza, and also constraining the government and the military's freedom of operation by telling us that we have to continue to give resupply to Hamas in Gaza under the false headline, the euphemistic term humanitarian aid. And he also said that people who do things like compare the Gazans to Amalek have to be called up on charges of incitement for genocide, along the lines set out by this kangaroo court at The Hague. And why did he do that? So first of all, because he wanted to show that he's one of the anointed in the international human rights milieu. And second, in the sort of post-nationalist progressive milieu. And then he ascribed to this kangaroo court the sort of vaunted ideals of this milieu that he aspires to be a member of and a leader of. But more importantly, from a domestic a domestic Israeli perspective and a domestic Israeli political perspective, what he essentially did was use this anti-Semitic judgment against his country as a means to, again, expand the power of Israel's legal fraternity. And anybody who's been watching this show for more than the past 3 months of war knows that for the past 10 months, Barak and his comrades in Israel's ruling class, in the legal fraternity and this national security community, were at war with the Israeli people and the Israeli government in order to prevent the elected leaders of Israel from curtailing the arrogated powers that these elites had seized for themselves over the past 3 decades. That was the goal of the legal reform agenda that the Netanyahu government put forward, and he was there with all of his comrades in arms to block it, to man the barricades. He said that tanks should come up to the Knesset, and he essentially incited civil war already at the outset of all of this back at the beginning of 2023. And so now he's using the opportunity that the government foolishly afforded him, thinking that, he was going to use his position to somehow or another block the criminalization of Israel by this political body that seeks to criminalize Israel. So instead, he used his participation in this kangaroo court to expand the domestic power of his cronies and of himself back in Israel among the Israeli ruling class, the anointed, the enlightened, etc. So that was a really appalling thing. And it's sort of interesting that the Ugandan judge did what we would have expected the Israeli judge to do, which is she rejected the entire case against Israel as completely unwarranted and appalling and extra legal. But not Barak. Barak said it's true. Israel isn't committing genocide, but we still want to treat it as a leper in the international community because it augments the power of myself and my comrades back home. So that is disgusting. But whatever. Now, what did the Palestinians say? They said it's totally disgusting that Israel wasn't ordered to stop the war. That's terrible, and we're really mad. But they also said this makes us very happy that they accepted the concept that Israel may be committing genocide, and we're just going to continue on. This isn't the last effort on our part to criminalize Israel as a genocidal, illegitimate state that deserves and must be annihilated. It's the first of many, and we plan to do this again and again and again and again. And eventually they'll get somebody to say that Israel has no right to exist, and they're right. I mean, this is a total win for them. They know that. The fact that they're saying it's not is just because that's what they always do. That's how they always go. They pocket every concession that they're given, and then they move on to the next thing. So they said, we're going to continue doing this over and over and over again. And they are. So now that Israel has participated in this spectacle, we can expect it to happen over and over and over again. So trying to appease the beast, feed the beast by sending them their best friend, Aaron Barak, has just whetted their appetite, and we're going to see a lot more of it. And, and it just to see how appalling the ruling really was. I mean, we have to think about what they didn't do. So on the one hand, they said, South Africa asked for a bunch of things to be done against Israel, one of which, of course, was the incitement to genocide thing. The other one was humanitarian assistance. Another one was try to get Israel to stop fighting. And then the court said, we're allowed to offer orders that the South Africans didn't ask for. So the anticipated response to something like that was, okay, then order Hamas not to commit genocide. Find that Hamas is committing genocide, that their intent is genocidal, and that they've incited genocide for the past, since they were established in 1987, and that they have to stop. And most importantly, order Hamas to release all of the hostages that it's holding. It's holding 136 Israeli hostages. This is a crime against humanity. And that order, any normal court would have issued such an order, particularly after it said that it has the power to give an order that it wasn't asked to give. But they didn't. They said we have the power, and then they didn't make that order. They didn't issue such an order. Instead, they issued a separate declaration that says, the court is gravely concerned about the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack in Israel. The attack, who carried out the attack, don't say. It was an attack carried out by Martians, carried out by Venetians from the planet of Venus, right? The court is gravely concerned about the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack in Israel on 7 October 23 and held since then by Hamas and other armed groups, and called for their immediate and unconditional release. But they never said that they were being held by the Palestinians. So they never said that the Palestinians were the ones that invaded Israel, and they never acknowledged that the people who are holding the Israelis hostage are Palestinians themselves. So this is on purpose. This isn't by mistake. It isn't sloppy draftsmanship. This is on purpose. They don't care about Hamas. What the purpose of this court in issuing these orders, as opposed to this declaration, was they are participating in the demonization of Israel, the criminalization of Israel, not the criminalization, again, of Israel's war in Gaza, which is completely in accordance with international law. It's the criminalization of the existence of Israel. And by the way, we should point out that the ICJ is supposed to issue an advisory opinion on another case this year, where they were asked by the UN General Assembly to issue. Professor Avi Bell talked about this when he was on my program a couple of weeks ago, that they were asked to issue an advisory opinion about whether or not Israel's control over Judea and Samaria, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights are illegal or not. And of course, they'll say they're illegal. So this is just priming the pump for yet another one that's coming out later, which also criminalized Israel. And, Avi Bell and also Professor Eugene Kontorovich, both professors came out immediately after this, along with Professor Moshe Ilya in Israel, another professor. They both recommended that Israel, first of all, that we not abide by any of the orders, then we certainly not report to the UN anything, to the ICJ anything in 30 days, but rather issue, a statement explaining how appalling the ICJ's behavior has been. And also, Bell and Kantorovich say that Israel has to withdraw from the jurisdictional clause of all of the treaties that it signed on to that provide jurisdiction over cases against it to the International Court of Justice. So that includes the Genocide Convention and I think 8 or 9 other conventions that Israel signed on to that the International Court of Justice seems to have jurisdiction over. So Israel should not comply with the order to report to the ICJ in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days or ever about any of its operations on the ground in Gaza. And also, it should end its adherence, its signing, its signature on all clauses and treaties that it's currently a signatory on that provide ICJ with jurisdiction over anything it does. As Eugene Kantorovich wrote in an article published in JNS, the United States has already bowed out of the jurisdictional clause of the Genocide Convention, as has India, both understanding that the ICJ is an inherently political body and not a legal body, and therefore should not have jurisdiction over their citizens in any way, shape, or form. So that's something that Israel should follow, and we should actually do it this week, as Professor Bell wrote to me in an email, and I think that that's true. We should not wait at all, and if Israel wants to continue to participate in this spectacle in any way going forward, then it must, absolutely must. It has to replace Aaron Barak with an Israeli jurist who is actually capable of understanding international law, understanding international political theater, particularly the anti-Semitic theater that we're seeing at the ICJ, and proceed accordingly in his judgments and in his actions at The Hague. And now I want to move to the cultural aspects of what we're seeing, because I think that they're very, very important. So first of all, regarding the claim of Amalek, I think, I have a sketch now for a book that I want to write, actually, that the title of is Amalek. And it came to me after, obviously, October 7th. And I think that we have to understand that the concept of Amalek, which is an enemy of the Jews that not for anything, the Jews don't pose any threat to Amalek. They don't seek any war. There's no aggressive actions. It's just apropos of nothing. Amalek wants to destroy the Jews. And they do it like we saw in the Torah reading that we read this past week of the Parsha of Shalach, that Amalek comes after the feeble first. They go after the weak, not after the strong. And that's obviously what we saw on October 7th when they went after families, when they went after old people, they went after small children, they went after babies. They went after unprotected women. All of these things, they went after the feeble, they went after the weak. And they did it in order to demoralize Israel and in order to annihilate the country. So there was just, it was a pernicious act of blind aggression, of naked aggression that had nobody, we were, like everybody says, if you want a ceasefire, we were at a ceasefire on October 6th. It stopped because Hamas and the people of Gaza in their thousands and their multitude invaded Israel and carried out a pogrom, the likes of which we had never seen before, even on Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany. So this is something that had no precedent, and it happened in southern Israel when it was invaded by these people. So the comparison to Amalek is valid on a number of levels, and the idea that this is incitement to genocide is really saying that noting the nature of reality of our enemy is incitement of genocide. So noting that your enemy is an entity that's geared towards your annihilation, apropos nothing, a completely unwarranted aggression, a completely unwarranted annihilation, like you didn't do anything to them, that's incitement to genocide. So that in and of itself, it's terrible, because you're saying you're not allowed to understand what Israel's enemies are about. And that's terrible. And then you go to the West, and what you see is that we're in this cultural moment or period time. I hope it's a moment, but it feels more like a period, where what you're seeing particularly in elite society in the West, is that people are generally comfortable with the idea of the Jewish people being annihilated in Israel and in the West, so all over the world, including in places like the United States and France and Britain, and so on and so forth. So that you're seeing among members of elite society this level of acceptance and even support for another Holocaust. And we've talked about it, the situation on college campuses. And over the weekend, I read an important article, and it's been much cited by Professor Niall Ferguson, who's at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. That he wrote it in the Free Press last month, called "The Treason of the Intellectuals," which is sort of a remake of Julian Benda's book of that title in 1927, "The Treason of the Intellectuals," and he was talking about the intellectuals of Europe's embrace of fascism, essentially, in the pre-Hitler times. And the point that Ferguson made in his article was that we saw that the treason of the intellectuals came into full bloom in our time after October 7th, with the legitimacy given to the calls for the annihilation of the Jews and the harassment, the institutional harassment by professors, by students, by student organizations of Jews on campuses at elite universities from coast to coast. And so he pointed out, and there are two quotes that I want to bring you from his article. So the first one was, he was talking about the fact that the most important thing that people don't understand is that that the Nazis that the professoriate at German universities in the 1920s were the best by far universities in the world. Harvard, Yale, they were no competition to the University of Berlin, all of these universities, Heidelberg, others in Europe, in Germany specifically, were considered the best universities from, I think, 1911, he said, to 1940. A quarter of the Nobel Prizes in sciences were given to German scholars, only 10%, I think, to American ones. So this was the balance of power academically between German universities and American universities. American universities actually became the best universities in the world when the Jewish professors from Germany ran away from Germany beginning in the 1930s, and many of them made their way to the United States. So he wrote here that non-German academia did not just follow Hitler down the path to hell; it led the way, because actually their comfort level with fascism and with genocidal anti-Semitism preceded Hitler's rise to power by over a decade, and they were already putting together the academic Hadna over genocide, over mass murder that the Nazis needed in order to, oil the wheels of their genocide machine. And then he said this, the final solution of the Jewish question began as speech when they talked about Jews as being subhuman. This was going back to the 1920s, to be precise. And it began as lectures and monographs and scholarly articles. It began in the songs of student fraternities with extraordinary speed. After 1933, however, it crossed into conduct. First, systematic pseudo-legal discrimination, and ultimately a program of technocratic genocide. So that they started out by saying Jews were subhuman, and then the whole gestalt of hatred towards Jews that you saw in fraternities, that you saw in all the social realm of university life, campus life in the 1920s, early 1930s. By the way, he said that doctors and lawyers were overrepresented in the early voters for the Nazis going back to the 1920s. And then in 1933, under the Nazi race laws, they banned all Jewish professors from teaching at universities. In 1935, anybody with, any Jewish roots, Jewish blood, were banned from the universities, so that you had a whole-scale expulsion of the top scholars in German universities, which was, as he said, a career opportunity for the Christians, which is another reason why so many of them were attracted to Nazism, because they were able to get tenured professorships through the ouster of all Jews from German institutions of higher learning. And so that was that brought in opportunists as well. And then they were explaining how to, even the technical things about, how to remove gold teeth from people's mouths after they're dead and then use them for the war machine, things like that. These were actually PhD theses in German universities during the war. So they were an essential part of the machine of genocide of Jews, and they preceded the Nazis' rise to power and then accompanied it throughout. And here, when you see Claudine Gay, for instance, of Harvard, who said that there's a distinction between speech from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, and actions, so actual mass murder of Jews. So long as people on campuses aren't actually massacring Jews, there's nothing wrong with them calling for the annihilation of Jews. That was the distinction that she made, along with Elizabeth Kornbluth, the one of the three Furies who appeared before the Congress in December, who hasn't been fired yet. So let's look for MIT to do something, and then Columbia might want to do something too, and a lot of other universities, all the same. So that's what he said. And then there was another article that I read over the week, and called Shylock at the UN, which was written by a literary critic at Tablet magazine named Mark Roth. And what he said essentially is that what we're seeing, he was talking more about the UN, but the ICJ is a UN institution. It's appointed by the UN. So he talked about having read The Merchant of Venice, William Shakespeare's anti-Semitic play, comedy, after October 7th, in the face of this incredible deluge of Jew hatred that American Jews have been experiencing, and obviously the convulsion of genocide, of Holocaust in Israel on October 7th. And he read the book, and actually his essay is well worth reading. And he talked about the concept of Shylockism being sort of a subspecies of Jew hatred. And basically he said it's a worldview that's hostile to Jews by default. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it's sort of the concept that like all of us by default are anti-smoking, right? At this point, in the culture wars, the smoking lobby completely lost, and all right-thinking people say that smoking is bad for you. Smoking is bad. Generally, people who smoke are bad and they should be shunned, not allowed to smoke in public facilities. In some cities, I think in New York, not allowed to smoke in the parks. I mean, it's like the total ostracism of anybody with a cigarette. Obviously, weed is a completely different story, but it's the concept of it's the accepted wisdom that smoking is bad. People who smoke are bad. People who advocate smoking are bad. So that's sort of taken for granted. And by the same token, Jews are bad. So that Shylockism is sort of this underlying social sentiment that there's something basically wrong about Jews. There's something basically wrong about Jews being alive. There's something certainly wrong about Jews having a country of our own, that country is Israel. That's basically bad. And that's the social atmosphere of Shylockism. That's what happened in the Merchant of Venice. That basically it's a story about Gentiles, for Gentiles. It's not a play that was directed towards the New York Jewish community. It was directed at the British audience at a time when Jews were banned from living in Britain. All of them were hateful towards Jews, and sort of the underlying social narrative in Britain at the end of the 16th century was deeply, deeply hostile to Jews. And so that's Shylockism, that everybody's basically agreed that there's something terribly wrong morally and otherwise with Jews. And then he gives this passage, which I think is very relevant as well. He says, "The Merchant of Venice offers up a theater of justice in the case of a Jew who is both wronged and vengeance-seeking. This Jew operates in a hypocritical Gentile world governed by Gentile laws, both written and unwritten, according to which the audience judges the Jew's case according to their own prejudices." So the Jews have a special law, and people judge the Jews' operation under law by their own hatred of Jews. So the prism is a sort of a double prism. One is that the Jews are subjected to a law that is sort of written for them. And the second is that when you're judging the Jews' operation in this judicial apartheid, you're doing it through the prism of your inherent, your socially grounded animosity towards Jews. Okay, and then he says, in this way, the Merchant of Venice continues to provide a paradigm for certain ideas of justice and fairness, both for Jews and about Jews, in the so-called court of international law and westernized public opinion. So Jews are treated to a singular standard that's inherently hostile and then judged by people who are inherently hostile. That's basically the concept of Shylockism. And that's what we're seeing today at the International Court of Justice and in the media and at UN and wherever else. And so he gives a quote by President Biden about a conversation that he had with Prime Minister Netanyahu that is very that's a sort of an exemplar of the concept of Shylockism. So here's a quote from Biden. Biden speaking, "It was pointed out to me, I'm being very blunt with you all, it was pointed out to me by Bibi that, well, you carpet bombed Germany, you dropped the atom bomb, a lot of civilians died." I said, yeah, that's why all these institutions were set up after World War II, to see that it didn't happen again, and it didn't happen again. Don't make the same mistakes we made at 9/11. There was no reason why we had to be at war in Afghanistan after 9/11. There was no reason we had to do some of the things we did. So Biden is setting Israel up, right? So on the one hand, you have Biden saying, Bibi said, well, you did it. And so what Bibi is demanding, right, is vengeance. Not that Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying, look, we have this society that just committed a one-day genocide against us and that we have to deny it the ability to do that ever again, given that we've seen the nature of this society. They murdered 1,200. They're holding 246 hostages, or 136 today. And we have to do everything that we can to defeat them, because they live at our doorstep, not 10,000 miles away like Afghanistan or Iraq from the United States, but 10 meters away, right there, right across the borders. They're right there. They're 4 kilometers from Be'eri. Hezbollah is 150 meters from Margaliot. I mean, you're talking about zero distance. So we have to defeat this society, not just Hamas, because it's the society that invaded Israel. And so Biden is saying, well, no, and we have all these institutions that are set up so that nobody does that anymore. Not Dresden and not Auschwitz, as if Dresden, which ended Auschwitz, was the moral equivalent of Auschwitz, which required Dresden in order to stop. Okay, so there's this confusion on Biden's part, but he says that you're not allowed to do what we did, even though what we did effectively ended genocide machine of Auschwitz, and you have to end this genocide machine of this genocidally imbued society in Gaza that is ruled by Hamas, which is a genocidal jihadist organization that seeks your annihilation. He says, no, we have these institutions, but these institutions, as we see, the ICJ today, the UN for the past 50 years, they're all organized around the concept of criminalizing the Jews' right to exist as free individuals in our state. So what he's saying is that you have these international institutions that are there to prevent genocide, but what they're actually doing in practice is enabling genocide. Actually, Eugene Kontorovich wrote in the article that I cited earlier that that the ICJ writing judgment or order on Friday was the diplomatic equivalent of October 7th. So here's Biden saying, no, you're not allowed to do what we did. And then take an example of what we did. We made a mistake, and therefore you're not allowed to defend yourselves, because I think that our war in Afghanistan was a mistake, and therefore you must not make war in Gaza. But they're not equivalent. They're not equivalent wars. They're totally different wars. And even then, like, what do you really think the United States didn't have to do anything after 9/11? I find that hard to believe. And if you look back to the contemporaneous statements by Biden, he was supportive of the war in Afghanistan. So the fact that he's saying that now, it A, doesn't reflect his thinking after 9/11, and B, the wars are completely different because one is 10,000 miles away and the other one is right here. And three, well, what are you saying that you fomented a strategic defeat by the for the United States in Afghanistan in August of 2022, and therefore you think that Israel shouldn't be allowed to fight at all? I mean, there's no connection, but it's this idea that the Jew may have been wronged, but we're also wrong. We're vengeance seeking. We're not. It's not that we have rights just like everybody else does. It's that when we demand our rights, we're attacked as being criminals. Shylock was a criminal for saying that he wanted the contract that he signed to be respected, and Israel is wrong to say that we need to defeat our enemies so that we can live without fear of October 7th happening again from Gaza or any other area. So, I think if we just go back to what Kontorovich wrote, that, that the ICJ's orders was the legal or diplomatic equivalent of October 7th, and we have to recognize that both of these events are existential assaults on Israel. So Hamas seeks to annihilate the Jewish state. That's an existential assault on the Jewish people, on the Jewish state, on our lives, on our families, etc. And they have to be defeated. But the ICJ's orders, its interim ruling that came out the day before International Holocaust Day on Friday, it is an action geared towards statecide, the annihilation of Israel as a state in the international arena, the effective denial of our legal right to exist, the effective denial of our moral right to exist, of our political right to exist. So it's politicide or statecide or whatever side you want to attach to it, but it is an act whose end is not something that we can, say, oh, okay, as the Israeli left has been trying to do under Barak's delusion, that, oh, well, we can manage this with our legal fraternity. No. The purpose here, they're not trying to help their domestic allies, although their domestic allies may be helped by them. Our progressives may feel assisted by them, but rather their goal is much larger, just as Hamas called the far left kibbutzim that they invaded, and Sderot and Netivot or Ofakim that they invaded on October 7th, which are working class towns, and then these sort of bon-ton far left kibbutzim all along the border. They called all of them settlements. Of course, none of them are in Judea and Samaria, right? Because Israel for them is inherently and completely illegitimate. It doesn't matter if you're a peace activist or a hilltop youth. They want you dead because you're a Jew. So too, the International Court of Justice is not saying, look, if Barak and the left-wing generals were in charge of Israel, we wouldn't have a problem. And the problem for us is just who's in charge of Israel. No. They're saying that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself, that Israel's military operations in Gaza in a war for national survival are, on the face of it, likely to be genocide, right? When there's no truth to this whatsoever. So it's and now we're supposed to prove that we're not committing genocide. So we're supposed to prove a negative, which is insane. Nobody else has to do this, and we're being subjected to legal apartheid, and the purpose of South Africa and Hamas here that the court has joined is the cause of nullifying Israel's right to exist politically, legally, etc., through the use of legal theater at the ICJ. So obviously, both of these are existential threats against Israel, and Israel has to continue on fighting the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon as well, and the war against Iran, which is fueling all of these things, as a war for its very existence. And it must do the same thing in the legal battlefield and diplomatic battlefield against forces like these ICJ. And that means no more Mr. Nice Guy, no more trying to win points. We just have to reject the entire system, because that system that Joe Biden says was formed in order to prevent another Auschwitz is actually a system that's setting the ground for such a thing. And we simply cannot participate in this again, ever. So anyway, those are my thoughts for today, and I'll see you again in a couple days. Take care.